Good morning and welcome to Ask the Expert. I'm Joe Taylor. This morning, another in the ongoing series of programs presented by the Northwest Regional Key Program for Quality Early Learning. The program, through the Northwest Institute of Research, oversees a grant from the Office of Child Development and Early Learning at the Pennsylvania Department of Human Services and the Department of Education. The goal of the program is to improve the outcomes for young children as they prepare for school. John Poza from the Pennsylvania Key is the host of the program and is with us throughout the series. And good morning to you, John. And who do we have on the line with us today?
Good morning, Joe. This morning we have Deborah Wise on the line, and Deborah is currently the Chief of the Division of Standards and Professional Development with the Office of Child Development and Early Learning. Deb oversees Pennsylvania Pre-K Counts and the Head Start Supplemental Assistance Program. And just for our listeners to know that the Division of Standards and Professional Development is also responsible for the development and implementation of the early learning standards, including a focus on effective instruction and appropriate assessment strategies for young children. Welcome to the program, Deb.
Thank you so much.
Hey, first off, I wanted to touch base with you to talk a little bit about some of your responsibilities, but let's specifically start with the early learning standards, because I know that's a passion of yours. And I know that the standards have gone through a little bit of a change. So let's just address those, especially for so the educators that may be listening to see how they may be impacted.
Sure.
So what are the things that maybe that they may not be aware of that were like little tweaks in the standards that they will have to know about?
Sure. So the early learning standards have gone through a revision process. We actually did the revision process in two phases. The first phase, we looked at specifically our infant toddler and our pre-kindergarten early learning standards. We did that revision and completed that revision process in 2014. And then from that process, we looked at revising our kindergarten, first grade, and second grade early learning standards, and that revision process wrapped up in 2016. So we do have fully revised versions of the full early learning standards continuum from birth through grade 2. The main igniter for us looking at revising the standards was looking at the Common Core revisions in English Language Arts and Mathematics specifically.
Right.
We also wanted to update our early learning standards, particularly our supportive practices for the adults working with our youngest learners, looking specifically around putting in some more supportive practices around children with special needs and also our dual language learner population. So educators will see some updates, particularly in our supportive practices around those areas. We also have updated, and we have actually added in our standards a little icon of a leaf. And that represents in our supportive practices STEM supportive practices. So STEM stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And those supportive practices are throughout the different areas of our learning standards to help educators understand where they can integrate those particular areas into all of the domains of learning that are encompassed in the early learning standards.
Okay. Now I know that, of course, the Common Core is the big buzzword with educators, and you know, there are pros and cons, obviously, with Common Core within school districts across the state and also across the country. A big emphasis, obviously, on those STEM principles. Can you give us a little bit of a sense for, in those changes that were made in the early learning standards, what would be a good example of something that was done to address STEM?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, STEM directly relates to science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. So you would assume that there would be a lot of STEM, particular content, but also supportive practices in those particular learning areas. What we were very intentional about doing is adding the STEM supportive practices into some, the other learning domains. So educators will find STEM supportive practices throughout the language and literacy standards, for example, the creative thinking standards. Representation is a huge factor in the STEM approach, where students are working through a project per se. And
Right.
It's really important for them to be able to represent their findings of their particular projects. So the creative arts can really help in that representation process. So we have students working through various projects. They come up with a question, they research that question, and then they try things out. And in that trying out, they represent their findings in various ways. And educators can really support that by looking at creative arts ways for students to represent their findings. So that's a really important thing that we've added into the standards, is looking at how the STEM concepts and STEM supportive practices are really integrated through all of the various learning domains.
That's fantastic because, and of course, there's always been this belief that the arts in some way, shape, or form has to be integrated within STEM principles, and they very easily can be, because it's that artistic expression that in any kind of given project or problem solving that a child or a teacher can help facilitate, that uses STEM principles, yet it is a creative or an artistic way of tackling a project.
Yes, and we've also integrated the STEM concepts into more of the learning engagement standards,
Right.
For example, the social and emotional standards, and what we call our approaches to learning standards. So a lot of the folks are calling 21st century skills, things that business leaders are really looking for their workforce to have, like task analysis, reasoning and problem solving, being able to collaborate on a team. These are all key standards in our early learning standards and are also key factors in that STEM approach. So when students are completing STEM projects, they're doing this as a team. They have to come up together with collaborative ways to think about their question and how they're going to approach their problem. And then they work together, either to produce a result or to come up with their project. And to do that, they have goals. They have to break those goals down into tasks. And they often experience, setbacks or problems as they're working through their project that they have to be responsive to. So, our early learning standards really are the foundation, for all later learning, and really kind of set that trajectory for, not just learning engagement in school, but just being able to kind of tackle everyday problems that they encounter in life as well.
Right.
If I can, I'd like to take this way, way back down to kindergarten. There is something called the Kindergarten Entry Inventory. Okay, and I've heard young parents discussing this, the Kindergarten Entry Inventory, viewing it as a test, which they believe could prevent their child from entering kindergarten. Can you comment on that?
Sure. So the purpose of the Kindergarten Entry Inventory is actually not to be used in a screening fashion. So what you just described, there are screeners that schools sometimes provide at kindergarten registration, for example, that gives the schools a sense of where the children are in various areas. Some schools do use those types of tests, not to exclude children from kindergarten, but maybe to place them in certain groupings. That is not the intent of the Pennsylvania Kindergarten Entry Inventory. It is not designed as a screener. So when we talk about assessment, there are different purposes. And as I mentioned, the KEI is not a screener. What it is a tool that is actually given, not even given, but evidence is collected by the kindergarten teacher during the first 45 calendar days of the kindergarten year. So it's actually not even given before the child enters kindergarten. It is an observation-based evidence collection assessment. So what that means is it's very different from assessments that are given in higher grades where students actually sit down and pen and paper take a test. It's not that kind of assessment. It's assessment that the teacher actually collects work samples, engages students in performance-based activities, or actually just sits back and observes the students in everyday experiences, the routines that they go throughout a typical school day, the transitions, even recess time. Teachers can be observing the students. And then there's a list of 30 standards-based indicators. There is a learning progression for each of those indicators. And as the teachers are collecting evidence and observing the students, they're looking for actual behavioral indicators or things that they can see the students doing, and then they score the students in those 30 standards-based indicators. It's really designed to give a description of how students are doing upon entry into kindergarten, and it will help the teachers understand and get to know their kindergarten students as early as possible in the kindergarten year. And when I say get to know them, I mean in a comprehensive way. So not just do they know their letters, do they know their numbers, and those sorts of more content-based competencies, but how are they getting along with their peers? Are they interested in new topics? So it is a very comprehensive assessment.
Right. We're talking with Deborah Wise, the Chief of the Division of Standards and Professional Development with the Office of Child Development and Early Learning, what we often refer to on the short term as OCDEL here on the program. And Deb, we were talking about the kindergarten entry inventory, and I know that the first kind of study was done on the impact that it's had, and I know it's been a short time that the KEI was implemented. So, a lot of people may not know about the results of what the study showed. So can you comment about that?
Absolutely, John. We actually just received the final report or the final findings from our commissioned validation study of our kindergarten entry inventory. This study was done in collaboration with the American Institutes for Research, or AIR, and the University of Pennsylvania. And again, we just received the results of the study within the last few days. We have been working with both AIR and Penn over the last 2 years. So the results really show that the KEI is scientifically supported to report on 2 dimensions of competency. So I mentioned the 30 standards-based indicators.
Right.
Those indicators basically can be rolled up into 2 different overall dimensions. And those dimensions are emerging academic competencies and learning engagement competencies. So the emerging academic competencies include indicators such as literacy indicators like recognizing letters, being able to match the letters to their sounds, naming numbers, counting, and also some text analysis and some stages of writing indicators.
Right.
So very content-driven competencies. The learning engagement competencies involved those areas that I mentioned before that a lot of people refer to as 21st century skills. So a lot of the emotional and behavioral regulation competencies, conflict resolution, some engagement, attention, and persistence competencies, the task analysis, and then also the fine and gross motor competencies are also involved in that particular area. So basically those 30 standards-based indicators roll up into these 2 kind of broader definitions of what we're looking at as children are entering kindergarten. That that's one of the major findings of the study is how those indicators work together and can be rolled up into these two very distinct dimensions of learning.
How can parents know that the the preschool program that their child is enrolled in is addressing the areas with which the kindergarten entry inventory is concerned, or is that the wrong way of looking at it, that you're trying to prep the kids for something that is an indicator as opposed to a test?
Yeah, so I think there's a very strong relationship between our previous conversation around the early learning standards and the implementation of the kindergarten entry inventory. So the learning standards are really the broad umbrella, particularly in our 0 to 5 programs. We want our programs utilizing the early learning standards, the full continuum of the early learning standards as they're working with children on a daily basis. The KEI is standards-based, so the 30 indicators actually are 30 of the standards. The early learning standards have a lot more than 30 standards. So we want our early learning providers and our K-3 folks looking at the full continuum of the early learning standards throughout the day. The KEI is the snapshot, and it took us 5 years of development really to get to the 30 standards-based indicators that are now included in the kindergarten entry inventory. And I often tell people, when you're looking at assessment, we had to look at the 30 indicators. We looked at national research to determine which are most predictive of later school success, but we also worked very closely with kindergarten teachers. We had to look at the curriculum they were providing within the first 45 days of the kindergarten year and what standards they were actually addressing, which standards are actually the most easily to collect evidence on and to score within those first 45 days of kindergarten. And that's how we actually kind of whittled down the full continuum of standards to these 30-based indicators in the KEI. So, again, it's a snapshot. It's not meant to be the full range of what children are expected to be able to know or do, as they're moving through early learning and then into formal schooling. But it is a nice, quick snapshot. We would want our early learning providers, again, to look at the full spectrum of the early learning standards, of which the 30-based indicators are included.
And if I may give an example, the Community Innovation Zone grantees that I've worked with in the Northwest, they have used the KEI, and I always cite an example of an elementary school in the Erie City School District that used the KEI, Lincoln Elementary, and they used it. They actually have a 3-year-old classroom and a 4-year-old preschool classroom, as well as K through, I believe they're K through 5 in that particular school. But they tracked the KEI over, since it started, really. And they immediately noticed that when a lot of those kiddos got to kindergarten, they noticed that there was they lost a little bit of the socio-emotional component, okay? Or they were not where, maybe not saying all of them, but a lot of them were not where they needed to be, and they thought that that was because of a lot of loss of maybe the playtime part that they had in preschool. So they actually were using that data, and still to this day, to work on their lesson planning and curriculum to address that, to incorporate time to address that issue. So that to me was a perfect example of what the KEI can do in basically kind of helping you inform your instruction and planning in the later grades.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're hoping schools are doing with their KEI, not just the data that they get out of doing it, but also as they're engaging in the process of collecting evidence and kind of helping that to drive. I mentioned them getting to know their students earlier in the process. I always talk about the KEI from two different perspectives, and this study really supports those two different perspectives in these two dimensions. So there's the content perspective, the emerging academic competencies. So what is the knowledge base that students need to have to be successful in kindergarten and throughout their formal schooling career so that they do well on tests later on, like the PSSAs? But what are the process or the foundational learning engagement competencies that students really need to have to be successful in a learning environment where they are working with other students? They have to be responsive to directions. They have to be engaged and attentive. They can't let their emotions overwhelm them, so they have to regulate in that setting. The KEI gives the teachers a full perspective of not just what to teach the children, but also how to teach them. So if they need that emotional regulation support, the teacher really should be addressing those competencies first. Because like we always say, if you're sad or mad, you can't add, right? You have to address the emotional competence before students can really attend and engage in the content piece.
And I also wanted to mention, Deb, that the kindergarten entry inventory, as of now, is still a voluntary process. A kindergarten or school district is not required to administer it. However, you may want to mention that if, in fact, there's a school out there listening, or someone that is listening from that school, who maybe want to look into administering if it's not being done in their school, what do they need to do?
Sure, yes. We invite any school district, public or private, that has kindergarten. They're welcome to implement. It is free of charge. We have a landing page for our kindergarten entry inventory. It's www.kei-pa.org. And all of the contact information is on that site. We actually have a resource account that interested schools can directly email and let us know that they're interested. And we can definitely reach out with any questions and get folks signed up. We're still recruiting for the 2017 school year.
Right, and of course there's a training component that's online once a school is registered on that account. But if they would like to have a training in person and have at least, I believe, 20 or 25 teachers and an administrator present, someone from Oakdale can actually come to your site and do it in person. So that's also available as well. I'll tell you, our time has gone really fast, Deb. I wanted to thank you for such an engaging conversation, because I can't help but think that, some mothers and parents listening probably didn't realize so much was involved in the planning of their child's early years and education. But it really sets the bar where it should be for the future, to make sure that our kiddos are successful not only in school but in life, and getting off on the right start is so critical. So, Deb, thank you so much for being on the program, and hope to have you on again.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
And that's our program for today. We'll be back in 2 weeks at this same time. In the meantime, you can go online to learn more at papromiseforchildren.com. For John Posa and the Northwest Regional Key Program for Quality Early Learning, I'm Joe Taylor. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.